My aunt Annalise passed away, a woman I don't even remember meeting but whose death seemed to shake the whole family. I was sent to stay overnight with my cousins. We called them the Politos because they were Uncle Polo's kids. They took us to their maternal grandmother's house, a woman I had never met before. The Politos called her Mama Carmen, and she asked me to call her that too. Her house was made of wood, creaking everywhere, but it was big, like the ones in the movies. It was large enough to keep us entertained playing hide and seek all afternoon. That's how I started exploring the house. I found myself discovering it, hiding in its dark corners. There was something about the house that made me feel as though I was at home, but when it was time to go to bed, they left me in an empty room. Before leaving, the oldest Polito told me something that completely unsettled me. "Whatever you do, don't answer them," he said. "What?" I asked. "Don't answer the voices, the ones that will talk to you from under the bed." Honestly, I felt weird about it, but at that moment, I didn't think it was serious. I assumed it was just a prank to scare me, like the ghost stories I sometimes made up when people stayed at my house. I fell asleep deeply, but I thought I heard a voice calling me. At first it was in my dream, but then I distinctly heard it as I opened my eyes. Then there was silence. A long silence. When I was about to fall asleep again, I heard it once more. "Felipe." I recognized that voice. I hadn't heard it in years and had almost started to forget it. It was my mom's voice. My dead mom's voice. I got up silently and left the room, unable to look back or glance under the bed. When I reached the door to the room where the Politos were, I felt so embarrassed. They were troublemakers and loved to tease. If they saw me so scared, they'd never let me live it down. So I mustered up the courage to return to my room. It was impossible for that to be happening. I had to be dreaming. This had to be a dream. I went back, lay down, and told myself I just needed to fall asleep again. And after some time had passed, when I was more asleep than awake, I heard it again. "Felipe, I forgive you." "You have nothing to forgive," I muttered, almost asleep. "You wanted me to die, but I forgive you. Everything is okay." My mom had a paralysis condition that affected her in her final years of life. I was the one who had to care for her after my dad left. I did it all on my own. He said he couldn't handle the responsibility, but he kept sending money to cover all the expenses. But I was the one there who stopped playing, stopped doing homework, stopped going out with friends. My life became just one thing: taking care of my mother. And back then, I hated my life and everyone in it. Yes, I wished my dad would die wherever he was. I wished my mom would die so she could finally rest and no longer be lying there, unable to move, unable to eat on her own, unable to go to the bathroom by herself. That wish is something I had never told anyone. And half asleep, half awake, I asked for forgiveness from whatever it was that was speaking to me from under the bed. I lowered my hand. I don't know what I was expecting. If I expected something to touch me or to feel something, anything, but I lowered my hand, and eventually I fell asleep. I was awoken by a distant noise. A sensation in my hand. Something was touching it. A rough, coarse hand that emerged from under the bed. At first I thought I was still dreaming. I didn't want to open my eyes, but I could feel it holding my hand. My heart was pounding, and it felt like something was pressing on my chest. But at the same time, my curiosity was stronger. That feeling that something was wrong, that something was under the bed, overwhelmed me. and without knowing why, I mustered the courage to look down. I swear it was there, barely visible, a hand with long, thin fingers, a hand emerging from under the bed, a hand that clung to mine. Its skin was grayish, dry, as if it belonged to someone who hadn't seen the light in years. I remembered the cold I felt throughout my body, but I was frozen, unable to let go of that hand, which was now gripping mine tightly. "Forgive me," whispered the voice in a tone that was both pleading and accusatory. I remained silent, trying to process whether this was real or if I had simply fallen asleep again, if I was just trapped in a nightmare. "Do you forgive me, Felipe? Do you forgive me?" The voice insisted again, but with a tone I had never heard from my mother before. It was as if something else, something different, was using her voice. But it was distorted, making it foreign, disturbing. It was my mother's voice, but at the same time it wasn't hers. It was then that I remembered what the oldest Polito had told me: don't answer them. And there, with that hand gripping mine, I suddenly understood the weight of his warning. I realized he meant it literally, but it was too late. I had already spoken. Not knowing what else to do, I bit my lip and closed my eyes, wishing that whatever it was would just disappear. I pulled my hand back to free myself, but the grip tightened. I felt as if the hand was beginning to drag me downward, as if it wanted to pull me under. "Felipe, let me go. Felipe, let me go," murmured the voice, now softer, almost pleading, but it was no longer a plea that moved me. I retreated to the wall, feeling my breath quicken. Seconds, or perhaps minutes, passed in a silence so heavy it felt impossible. Shortly before dawn, I heard noises in the kitchen. I bolted out of the room and found Mama Carmen getting up. I told her what had happened. She listened silently, with an expression I couldn't quite understand. In the end, she smiled and told me not to overthink it. She said it was probably just a hallucination, brought on by all the running around in cemeteries and funerals over the past few days. She told me not to pay attention to her grandchildren, saying they were just mischievous kids who loved ghost stories and had surely taken the opportunity to scare me, planting that idea in my head. According to her, they had made up that warning about not answering the voices so that no one would go into that room, a room they themselves had always been scared of. But while I wanted to believe her, I knew I had heard my mother's voice. That part I remembered clearly, just as clearly as the words she had spoken to me. What I'm still trying to convince myself was just a nightmare is that cold, rough hand, like that of a corpse, that came out from under the bed. Because even though I tell myself every night that it was just a dream, that memory remains like the most vivid nightmare I've ever had in my life. My grandmother told me this story before she passed away nearly 5 months ago. She assured us it was true. She said that when she was young, there was a very rude woman in her life. This woman had taken charge of the house and meals after my grandmother's mother passed away at an early age. That woman wasn't just rude, she treated my grandmother like a servant. My grandmother was so scared of her that she avoided being alone with her. Beyond the verbal abuse, the woman would pinch her and pull her hair if she didn't obey. Eventually, this woman fell ill and was bedridden for a long time, suffering from a disease that ultimately led to her death. On the day she died, she asked to speak with my grandmother. She said she wanted to say goodbye and apologize for all the harm she had done. My grandmother didn't want to enter the room. She was terrified of seeing her in such a deteriorated state, even more so because she had always felt a strange energy around her presence. She said the house felt cold and heavy, as if something evil lived there. Finally, my grandmother went into the room. The woman, with a weak voice, asked for forgiveness. My grandmother told her that she forgave her and that she should rest in peace, and find her way to God. However, the woman replied with a dark look, "I'm not going to God anywhere but with Him." That same afternoon, the woman passed away. After her death, the house felt colder and more eerie than ever. While they waited for someone to come and take the body, they said a chilling wind blew through, whistling as it passed through the trees. Being surrounded by woods, nothing was visible beyond the shadows of the trees. There was no sound except for the wind whispering through the branches. In the middle of that silence, my grandmother heard what sounded like crying, a distant wail, deep and mournful, coming from the woods. She didn't know if she was imagining it or if something was truly crying out there. That night, as others prepared the house for the wake, my grandmother stayed in the kitchen, feeling an unusual cold for that time of year. The next morning, while the body was being watched over, my grandmother and her cousins were playing in the yard. There was an old huizache tree where the woman often sat when she was alive. They decided to play hide and seek around it. At one point, my grandmother and one of her cousins ran to the tree to hide, but when they got there, they froze in their tracks. She couldn't move. Her legs trembled because there, sitting under the tree, was the same woman they were watching over inside the house. She said the woman stared at her with dark, empty eyes, completely devoid of life. My grandmother felt a terror like she had never experienced before, as if she were seeing something that didn't belong to this world. Her cousins saw it too. The two of them ran back, their hearts racing. They knew it wasn't possible. The woman they were watching over shouldn't be there. She was already dead. While the adults prayed for the woman's soul, my grandmother listened to the words, which, though they spoke of God and the Virgin Mary, sounded chilling in the silence of the woods. The prayers seemed to float among the trees and the wind, creating a macabre atmosphere. Even years later, recounting this story still gave my grandmother chills. They ran back to the house. My grandmother rushed into the room where the wake was taking place. Everyone stared at her in surprise because of the way she barged in, but she only wanted to confirm that the body was still there in the coffin. When she approached and saw the body, she felt her heart stop. She was certain she had seen the woman outside, sitting under the huizache tree. But the body remained in the coffin while the wind and prayers continued in an ominous tone. The next day, they took the woman to the town cemetery. The ceremony went as expected. They held the mass, performed the burial, and placed a rosary in her hands, crossing them carefully over her chest. However, the following day, someone brought news that the body had been dug up. My grandmother's father went to the cemetery immediately, and to his shock, found the coffin open and the body lying outside, with its arms extended. The rosary that had been placed in her hands was inside the coffin. They put her back in, repeated the burial, and tied her hands together. That night, someone again reported that the woman's body had been dug up. They thought it might be a macabre joke or an act of vandalism, so they decided to post guards at the cemetery. Once again, they placed her in the coffin, tied her hands, and placed the rosary between her fingers. But the next morning, the body was outside again, in the same position, with arms extended. This time, the smell of decomposition was impossible to ignore. The situation couldn't continue. The body was already showing signs of decay. The priest suggested that perhaps the woman was rejecting consecrated ground. With great sorrow, the family decided to remove her from the cemetery and bury her outside sacred ground. It was only after this final burial, far from the cemetery, that the body finally seemed to rest in peace. Since then, no one ever saw her spirit wandering the house again, and there were no more incidents of the body being unearthed. Her grave to this day remains outside the cemetery, the only one in that location. It serves as an unsettling reminder of that presence that didn't want to find peace among the dead. I know this story may seem simple, but my grandmother always assured us it was true. She said the fear she felt in that moment was profound, because it's not normal for a body to be unearthed so many times.